Well, we'll probably have a sentencing in 75 to 90 days before the district court. So Mr. Greenberg pled today pursuant to his plea agreement, and he's bound by its terms, and he intends to honor it.
That's Fritz Scheller, the defense attorney who represented Joel Greenberg during his plea negotiations with federal prosecutors. Scheller spoke to reporters Monday following a hearing in which his client formally accepted a deal with the government that requires Greenberg to cooperate with the, quote, investigation and prosecution of other persons, unquote. As for who exactly those persons might be, Scheller wouldn't say.
What does this mean for other people that are not named specifically in the plea deal, but are mentioned?
Well, you'll just have to draw your own conclusions on that.
What does this mean for Matt Gaetz?
You'll have to ask his attorneys on that.
As Scheller played coy, a small plane circled overhead. It had been there, gliding above the federal courthouse in downtown Orlando for most of that morning. Behind it, the plane towed a sign with an ominous message for one of Greenberg's former friends and allies. Tick-tock, Matt Gaetz. Hello and welcome to Joel Greenberg, the man, the scandal, the players, brought to you by the Orlando Sentinel. I'm your host, Jeff Weiner. As has been widely reported, Gaetz, a congressman from the Panhandle who became a national political figure as one of President Donald Trump's most ardent defenders, is the subject of a federal investigation that emerged from the case against Greenberg, which centers on whether the two men had paid for sex and travel with a 17-year-old girl and women recruited through sugar daddy websites. Though Gaetz' name wasn't mentioned in Greenberg's plea deal, a recent report by CNN indicated that he was seen by investigators as a key witness against the congressman. With Greenberg's cooperation secured, the spotlight has now shifted to Gaetz, who has denied any wrongdoing, insisting he has never paid for sex or had sex with anyone underage.
It is a horrible allegation, and it is a lie. The person doesn't exist. I have not had a relationship with a 17-year-old. That is totally false.
However, the document Greenberg signed to formalize his cooperation lays out the basis for the sex trafficking case and some of the evidence that could become important to any future prosecutions. You'll notice I said prosecutions plural. That's because, while Greenberg remains the only person involved in this case who we know has been charged, the plea deal noted the existence of accomplices, such as a government official who helped Greenberg seek fraudulent COVID-19 relief loans, and a friend who helped recruit that person. And reports from outlets including Politico, CBS News, and the New York Times have linked other allies of Greenberg and Gaetz to the investigation, through a trip to the Bahamas, allegedly with a group of paid escorts, that is also reportedly central to the Gaetz probe. Scheller was pressed on this point. His answer was revealing.
How many co-conspirators are we talking here?
How about more than one?
In this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into Greenberg's plea deal, an 86-page mega confession that laid bare the remarkable brazenness of Greenberg's behavior before, during, and after his time in elected office. We'll also discuss the deal's implication for other people. But first, let's talk about exactly what Joel agreed to here. If you've been following along with us, you've heard the number 33 a lot. That's how many federal offenses Joel Greenberg was slapped with across 4 federal indictments since last June. In his cooperation agreement with prosecutors, he agreed to plead guilty to just 6 of those charges. But these are serious crimes with weighty penalties, and they trace the course of the case against him. Stalking, up to 5 years in federal prison. Production of a false identifying document, up to 15 years. Aggravated identity theft, a mandatory minimum sentence of 2 years. Wire fraud, the max for this is 20 years. Conspiracy against the United States, up to 15 years. And then there's sex trafficking of a child. Minimum, 10 years. Maximum, life. Of course, Greenberg, by virtue of taking a plea and agreeing to cooperate, hopes to serve as little time in prison as possible. Ultimately, his sentence will have a great deal to do with whether and to what extent he proves helpful to the prosecutors with whom he struck the agreement. We asked Mark O'Mara, an Orlando criminal defense lawyer and legal commentator, to break down the situation Greenberg faces.
Right now, he's got a 10-year minimum mandatory, which is the sex trafficking. And then he also has 2 years that have to be added on top of any sentence he gets. So now we're up to 12 years based upon the aggravated identity theft. So at the very least, he's going to get 12 years in prison. But remember that a federal judge has wide discretion to give Greenberg and any defendant virtually whatever they want or whatever can be justified by the facts. So if we start with that he's looking at least 12 years, the only way he gets under that 12 years is by substantial assistance. And that's going to be up to the level or the enormity of his assistance and how substantial it is, again, moving towards prosecution and conviction of other individuals.
If he's able to substantially assist the feds in other prosecutions, they could urge a judge to sentence Greenberg below that 12-year minimum. But when prosecutors offer a carrot, they also wield a stick. If he fails to toe the line, the consequences for the former public official could be grave. Sentinel reporter Manavet Cordero explains.
So under the terms of his deal, Greenberg is required to cooperate fully with the government. His cooperation has to be of substantial assistance to prosecutors. And if it's of substantial assistance, they can recommend a lower prison sentence to the judge. But he has to tell the truth. If he knowingly provides incomplete or untruthful testimony, implicates or incriminates someone else, or fails to cooperate, he can be prosecuted for perjury or obstruction of justice, according to the agreement.
The majority of Greenberg's plea agreement, 59 of its 86 pages, essentially consisted of a Reader's Digest confession, documenting the factual basis of each of the 6 crimes to which Greenberg pleaded guilty Monday. Presumably, anything in the document is something Joel could be called to testify about under oath. Among the eye-popping figures, $70,000. That's how much Greenberg admitted to paying women for sex over just 2 years. He said he met many of them through websites connecting young women, known as sugar babies, with older, wealthy men called sugar daddies. According to a report by the New York Times, one of the sites Greenberg used is called Seeking Arrangement. Here's one of their ads.
When it comes to dating, seekingarrangement.com gives me all the options I'm looking for. A place where the hunter becomes the hunted, and no woman is out of my league.
The ad features a man rejecting a nameless woman labeled the Clinger, who we're told wants to settle down, in favor of a woman labeled the Charmer, who introduces herself as Happiness.
Hi, I'm Happiness.
You can probably guess where this is going.
Who said money can't buy happiness?
The slogan for Seeking Arrangement is Relationships on Your Terms. Greenberg used at least 4 accounts to pay women for sex, including a tax collector's office American Express card. These transactions, typically between $200 and $1,000, were unconvincingly disguised as expenditures for wholesome things like school and ice cream. One person Greenberg paid for sex was 17 years old. Here's Sentinel reporter Jason Garcia with more.
Joel contacted this 17-year-old and asked her to provide him her Snapchat account, which he then used his own Snapchat account to contact her and arrange an initial meeting. That first meeting involved Greenberg meeting the 17-year-old on his boat. No sex occurred at that meeting, and he paid her approximately $400 for the encounter. But after that, he contacted her again using his phone or Snapchat and invited her to a hotel in the Orlando area. And at that hotel, he had sex with the 17-year-old and paid her over $400. That began a stretch of time where Greenberg would repeatedly meet up with the 17-year-old at hotels around the Orlando area, often with others, and engage in sex. Greenberg had sex with this 17-year-old at least 7 times while she was a minor. And during these meetings, he would often offer her and others ecstasy and take ecstasy himself. Greenberg also introduced the 17-year-old to other adult men who also had sex with her in Greenberg's presence. That's important because that Greenberg is a first-hand witness to these sexual encounters.
Greenberg admitted to frequently and illegally using his access to the state's driver's license system to investigate his sexual partners. And on the afternoon of September 4th, 2017, according to the plea agreement, Greenberg ran a search on the 17-year-old, quote, because he had reason to believe that the minor was under the age of 18. This lines up with a recent report by the Daily Beast, a news website which said it had obtained drafts of a confession letter that Greenberg wrote last year as he was seeking a presidential pardon for himself with the help of infamous political operative Roger Stone. In the letter, Greenberg claimed that this was the date he learned the girl was underage. Here's our producer, Wesley Alden, reading some of the confession.
Immediately, I called the congressman and warned him to stay clear of this person and informed him she was underage. He was equally shocked and disturbed by this revelation. She apologized and recognized that by lying about her age, she endangered many people. There was no further contact with this individual until after her 18th birthday.
But while Greenberg in the alleged confession letter said there was no way he could have known the girl was a minor, in his plea agreement he admits he should have known the truth. When Greenberg found out after his initial arrest last June that authorities were onto him for having sex with the girl, he immediately attempted to enlist her help with a cover-up.
Greenberg reached out to the minor, both directly and through one of her friends, for the purposes of trying to get her to lie to investigators about why he'd looked her up in the driver's license database in the first place.
Remarkably, Greenberg's abuse of Florida's driver's license database began long before he ever took office and was given official access to it. Sentinel reporter Martin Comas explains.
So here's how it began. Sometime in 2015, this is about 2 years before he became tax collector, Joel Greenberg purchased a boat from someone identified in court documents as RZ, and that's pretty much all we know about him. But it was during that transaction, that boat purchase, that Greenberg obtained RZ's personal information, and that included his date of birth, his address, his social security number, and his license number. And we can only assume that he obtained that personal information because he probably asked for a copy of his driver's license, for the purchase.
Somehow, Greenberg was able to use RZ's personal information to order a replacement ID in the man's name, which he had shipped to a P.O. box in Longwood that Greenberg had set up. This is Greenberg's earliest known foray into identity theft.
Now, jumping forward to January 3rd, 2017, and that's the day he became tax collector, Joel Greenberg changed the mailing address for RZ from that fake ID that he had created before he was elected from a Longwood post office that he originally used in that original fake ID back to RZ's actual residence. Now, we can only assume that he did this because he didn't want anybody to find out that he had created a fake ID.
However, Greenberg wasn't quite done with poor RZ's identity. That November, authorities say Greenberg used tax office resources to make a fake ID for himself with his own photo and RZ's personal info. When federal agents raided Greenberg's Heathrow home on June 23, 2020, the day of his initial arrest, they found the fake RZ driver's license in his wallet. And it wasn't the only fake or stolen license he had.
Now, we have to be clear that this person, RZ, never even knew that Joel Greenberg, Seminole County's tax collector, had done this with his personal information.
New at 5 now, the Seminole County tax collector goes on the record with his idea to create a digital, county-wide ID system. It would use the same technology as Bitcoin.
So began a September 2019 report by WKMG Channel 6, in which Greenberg gave an interview about his ambitious plans to digitize identification documents for Seminole County residents, using cryptocurrency technology in some way to make that information more secure somehow. Greenberg was attempting to explain why he had formed an independent company, Government Blockchain Systems LLC, within his county office with the help of a 22-year-old cryptocurrency expert. Here's a bit more of this report. Greenberg's voice is the third one you'll hear.
Blockchain is secure because data is decentralized. It's not stored on one server, so it can't be hacked. It's stored in blocks on many, many computers.
Meaning that once information's entered, it can't be changed. Almost like using a typewriter.
So somebody can take control of all their information. It can be encrypted.
Greenberg around this time gave other, completely different explanations for this venture. It was to provide citizens the ability to utilize digital currency as a form of payment for their taxes. Or it was to create an entirely new Seminole County-based cryptocurrency. Of course, none of this was true. Government Blockchain Systems was the latest in a series of convoluted scams with a very simple purpose: Greenberg wanted to use taxpayer dollars to loan himself money in order to buy himself cryptocurrency. This started early in his tenure. In September of 2017, Greenberg opened an account in the name of his office at Fifth Third Bank. Soon, he was depositing office resources into the account in increasing amounts. That December, he began asking his office's chief financial officer how much money he could get for a short-term investment. Here's an email Greenberg sent to the CFO that month, as read by our producer, Leslie Alden.
Will you please draft a check payable to the Seminole County Tax Collector for $100,000? I'm going to go with a short-term investment, which I believe will have a much higher yield in 60 to 90 days. Thank you. I'll be in today to pick it up.
Into the account at Fifth Third, the money went. And from there, it went to his personal bank account. From there, he transferred it into an account in his name with a cryptocurrency trading service. Within 5 hours, he'd spent it all on Bitcoin and other digital currencies. To repay his office, Greenberg borrowed $90,000 from a family member. About a year later, the pattern repeated, but with twice as much money. Greenberg spent $200,000 in office money on crypto, then borrowed that amount from a relative, telling the family member he was in big trouble for mixing public money with his own. But when the relative obliged, rather than pay back his office, Greenberg spent it on more cryptocurrency for himself. Then came April 23, 2019. On that pivotal date, a subpoena arrived at Greenberg's office seeking financial records related to, among other things, investments made using tax collector funds. By this point, the feds knew about Greenberg's Bitcoin spending, and now he knew that they were investigating him. So he went back to the same family member who months earlier had given him $200,000, asking for that same amount again. Greenberg delivered the money to his CFO, and it was deposited in a tax collector account the day after the federal subpoena arrived. If Greenberg was chastened, you wouldn't know it. That July, he launched Government Blockchain Systems. The Sentinel's Martin Comas exposed that entity's existence that September.
And how we found this out was through a state website that lists all the LLCs and all the businesses that are formed. And apparently, Joel Greenberg, according to the state documents, he had formed this Government Blockchain Systems LLC back in July of 2019. And when I called Joel Greenberg about it, he got rather a little annoyed that I was poking around, he said, on the state database, on the state website. And he asked me, he said, what are you doing poking around on a state website, bringing up my name on that?
Greenberg had made a telling mistake. When he formed his new Bitcoin company, to be funded with taxpayer dollars and housed on tax collectors' property, he did so in his own name, not that of his office. He attempted to explain to WKMG.
The paperwork's been corrected. It's been corrected to show that the Seminole County Tax Collector is the sole member of it. Before, it just listed the managers, and we've corrected that. So,
why did you form it that way originally?
It was probably an error. I mean, I should have put Tax Collector, Joel Greenberg Tax Collector on there instead of just my name.
Greenberg also admitted to claiming more than $432,000 in fraudulent loans through the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program with the help of a friend and a U.S. Small Business Administration employee. The Sentinel's Annie Martin explains.
So the loan agreement was not Greenberg's idea. A friend texted him 4 days before he was arrested and said he had an easy and quick way for him to get a loan of up to $160,000 and put Greenberg in touch with the Small Business Administration employee. These loans were intended for small businesses to help them weather the effects of the pandemic.
In his texts with his friend and the SBA worker, Greenberg didn't even pretend these loans were above board. At one point, he asked the friend about the money, quote, "How quickly can I blow it all on?" That exchange happened on June 20th. On June 23rd, Greenberg's downfall commenced. He was arrested on stalking and identity theft charges and led into a federal courtroom in shackles. Though he was released from custody that day, he was first warned that any crimes committed while he was awaiting trial could lead to severe penalties.
And on June 24th, the day after Greenberg was arrested, the SBA officer emailed an agreement to him for a loan of $133,000, and he executed the agreement. it required him to say he would use the money as working capital solely to alleviate economic injury caused by disaster occurring during the month of January 31st and continuing thereafter, and that he had not been arrested or convicted on felony charges since applying for the money. Now, of course, he had just been arrested on felony charges the day before he signed that agreement.
Greenberg resigned from his elected post and cleaned out his office, but he didn't stop committing crimes. In the days after his arrest, the SBA loan officer submitted 2 more applications on the behalf of long-defunct companies in no way harmed by COVID-19. Greenberg received his loans in 3 installments in late June and July. He shared some of the proceeds from the fraud with his conspirators, giving $16,000 to his friend and $3,000 to the SBA employee. The plea deal notes the SBA employee was a, quote, willing and knowledgeable participant in the fraud. As far as we know, the worker has not yet been charged, nor has Greenberg's friend. But both would appear to be in the crosshairs of federal authorities. Of course, the political world is not waiting with bated breath to learn the fate of a crooked loan officer or a Greenberg buddy with a hookup at the Small Business Administration. What everyone is waiting to see is what will happen to Matt Gaetz and other prominent figures. According to Mark O'Mara, the lawyer and legal commentator, for Greenberg to have gotten this deal, and if he has any hope of winning a reduced sentence, he's going to be expected to give actionable information about targets of equal or greater value to himself. O'Mara likened it to the way police take down drug trafficking rings, by enlisting lower-level figures willing to give up their superiors.
So if you keep that thought in mind, someone like Greenberg in this case, with the sex trafficking and other counts pending, he's going to have to be able to present to the grand jury through the prosecutor and through his proffers information that's going to lead to the arrest and maybe conviction of somebody equal or greater at risk that he is.
You may be wondering how the feds could hope to prosecute anyone on the basis of Greenberg's testimony. As we have documented extensively on this podcast, he's not a very reliable or truthful figure, and he's now a confessed fraudster and sex offender. But O'Mara notes that the team prosecuting this case, led by U.S. Attorney Roger Hanberg, have certainly considered that vulnerability.
His information is one thread, and they're not going to rely on that thread alone. They're going to have to weave in other information to that. So that's going to be what we call corroboration witnesses, other witnesses who say something similar, forensic evidence, other flipped witnesses or flipped co-defendants that may show up, because they're not going to rely on any defendant's testimony in and of itself, Greenberg or anybody else.
That said, O'Mara cautions that no one should presume the guilt of Matt Gaetz or any of the other figures whose names have surfaced in media reports about this case. As far as we know, only Greenberg has been charged. Gaetz went unmentioned in his former confidant's plea deal, and prosecutors have not publicly confirmed he's a target.
We've heard this almost innuendo, right? That Greenberg set up sex for other adult males with a child. And if one of those happens to be Matt Gaetz or anybody else, that person is in serious trouble for sex trafficking, just the way Greenberg is. But if we really think about it, Representative Gaetz deserves to wait and be accused when we have information with which to accuse him.
But as Fritz Schiller, Greenberg's attorney, acknowledged after his client sealed the cooperation deal this week, all eyes will be on what comes next.
Does my client have information that could hurt an elected official? I guess this is just, must-see television. You'll just have to wait and see.
That's the end of this episode. We hope you've enjoyed it. It was produced by the Sentinel's Wesley Alden and featured reporting from all the Sentinel journalists you heard from. In future episodes, we'll talk about Greenberg's sentencing, the connections of key figures in this saga to the medical marijuana industry, as well as any news that breaks of additional prosecutions that emerge from Greenberg's collaboration with federal authorities. Thanks for listening. Please rate the podcast, subscribe, and tell your friends. And continue to follow our coverage of this saga on orlandosentinel.com/Greenberg.